Doesn't always work, but it looks like it's going to work this time. Very good. Good. Okay, let me go ahead and get started here. Well, good morning, everybody. It is Friday, May 22nd, 2020, 11 a.m. Pacific time, and another round of, I'll just call it Bible studies and discussions with Jeff Carr and his friends. And today I've got more than a friend. It's a family member, Doy Moyer, with us from the Birmingham, Alabama area. I'm not sure exactly what town you live in. What town are you in, Doy?
We're in Vestavia, Hoover, down on the south side of Birmingham.
There we go. So you're close enough to Birmingham. But yeah, Doy. Make you feel right at home here. Can you see that, Doy? Can you see my background?
I see it now. You froze up there for a minute, so.
Very good. It's always a freeze there, but is that right side, or are you looking at that at a mirror image? Is that right? I want to make sure you can read it.
Yeah, I can read it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Something brings a smile to your face, loosen you up, make you feel comfortable. Because I've beat you at Halo. I don't think you've ever beat me once. And so, speaking of humility, we're going to talk about that in Philippians 2 today, right?
Bible says something about lying too. So.
Very good. Plenty of battles with you and your kids. So today we're going to be in Philippians chapter 2. And there's a lot there. A lot of it is about humility, verses 3 through 8. We may touch on some other things, but that's our focus today. So we're in Philippians chapter 2. And I'm going to start us off with a word of prayer, and then I'll have a few more introductory comments, and we'll get into it. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer as we begin. Father in heaven, it's good that we can be here today. Again, we thank you for this opportunity to bring all people together and that we can focus on your word. We're thankful for the internet for such times like this. We know that internet can be abused and misused, but we pray that we're using the blessings that you give us for good. And again, we ask for wisdom as we look into your word together. And we just thank you for opportunities such as this, when so many people can come together and focus on your word that you've preserved through the ages. We're mindful of the virus and the pandemic that's going around. And we pray for its minimization. We pray for its eradication. We pray for Christians to respond in a way that is salt and light and examples that you want us to be. And again, please be with us now during this study. It's in your son's name. Amen. So Philippians chapter 2, as a reminder, we are on Zoom, we are on Facebook Live, and I'm going to just make this only where Doy and I can be the speakers. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type those in. There is a chat session in Zoom, and there's also a chat session in the Facebook, and I'll be looking at those. And if you have anything, I'll interject those as I see fit. But for now, again, please just leave the conversation to Doy and I. It's just simpler that way. Okay, Doy, when I recruited you and got you to speak, be one of my members here of my little COVID online Bible study parties here, I gave you some options and you quickly jumped on Philippians 2. Why did that stand out over all the other options I gave you and all the other options available to us?
Oh, it's just a passage that has long intrigued me, and I've run it over in my mind many, many times. And I think it's important because it says something not only about the nature of Jesus, but about the nature of our own service to the Lord as well. In my mind, there have been not many passages as powerful to express both the nature of Jesus and the nature of our humility, what we ought to be doing as we follow his example. Because verse 5 kind of expresses what we ought to be, have the mind of Christ.
We're looking at the humility of Jesus, and of course we want to mimic and imitate that humility all throughout Philippians, one of my favorite letters. It's remarkable that it is an upbeat letter, reminding us to have joy and to rejoice. He's writing from a prison as he does that, but he reminds them of their blessings. And the early part of Philippians 2, he, to me, talks about unity and their fellowship they should have, verses 1 and 2. But then in verse 3, that unity, the dangers of, if we're not unified, there's going to be dangers, and we need to get those corrected before we think anything about evangelism. But how do we take on that unity with each other? And that really leads to verse 3, the humility there. If you don't mind, let me read verses 3 through 8, and we can just kind of go through some of the things there. Let me just read that. Philippians 2, verse 3 says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Have this attitude in yourself, which also is in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." One of the questions I had for you was, we don't become humble by thinking we're humble. I just think I'm humble and that's it. How do we become humble?
Well, this passage gives us, I think, the key to that concept. Just a couple of general remarks about that. I think sometimes this passage has gotten a lot of attention over the centuries, particularly the idea of Jesus emptying himself, or as King James puts it, making himself of no reputation. What does that mean, and all that? And I'd like to come back to that later, but I think we tend to look at that as, this is a theological passage, and what's the effect of that? But it's really not meant to be that. I think it's meant to be a practical passage. That Paul is giving practical instruction based upon the actions and attitude that Jesus himself displayed. And so verse 5 again becomes the key to this: have this attitude which was in Christ. And then you have to ask those questions. Well, what did Christ do? What is the mind of Christ? How is that expressed? And then how do we go about following after that? So it's just kind of a series of things. But verse 5, I think, is the key to this whole issue here.
This attitude, verse 5, submission and love are the things that to me come to mind when he speaks about just before. It seems also, if you want to define greatness, if God is looking for greatness, how do we define that? You go back to Matthew 19 and 20, 18 and 19 rather, and the disciples are asking, who's the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus has to call the child to himself. And then at the end there, he says the first will be last and the last will be first. And really that's, to me, that now we're touching on what humility is, right? This is the attitude we must have in ourselves, of not thinking we need to be the greatest in the show off. We need to just have a servant-like, humble mindset where we're here to serve others. And that's, sum up the life of Jesus. That's it, right? I mean, he came out of heaven and he served us when he didn't have to. He could have been king on earth if he wanted to.
Well, Jesus, had taught his apostles that, in the world, the lords lorded over the kings, or, all of that. But among the disciples, it's really not supposed to be that way. First shall be last, the last first. I mean, these are the types of teachings that we find all through the gospel accounts. And so, Philippians 2, I think, is mirroring that basic idea. But let me just make this point, though, about that. And I want to go back to verse 7, kind of work backwards a little bit, maybe,
okay,
to see what the significance of this is, to understand what humility really is. So if we start there with verse 7, and he says, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. And ask, well, what does that mean? Because this is the attitude of Jesus. He emptied himself. Well, what does that mean? I like to do a little test usually when I'm teaching this in a Bible class, and I'll ask the question. I said, take a look at your Bible, put your eyes on the text, and then ask, what did Jesus empty himself of? Now, I ask it that way specifically because typically in the debates about this passage, people start enumerating upon the things Jesus emptied himself of. He emptied himself of glory, or he emptied himself of this or that. And usually in a class, that's what people will start to say. Well, he emptied himself of this. And I'll say, let's stop and look at the text again. What does it say specifically he emptied himself of? And of course, the answer is it doesn't say that. What it says is he emptied himself. And that's different from saying he emptied himself of stuff. You see what I'm getting at?
Right.
It's important because, and I think that's really important, because when we talk about the nature of what Jesus did in his humility, Jesus didn't just give up stuff. He didn't give up attributes and characteristics of himself or anything like that. What he did was he gave himself. So when I look at a passage, let's say what I would call a parallel concept in Luke 9:23, that Jesus says, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up the cross daily and follow me. Jesus doesn't say, deny yourself of stuff. He says, deny yourself. And there's a difference. In other words, he's not asking for just part of us or a little bit of us or this or that from us. He's asking for us, which really gives us more the concept of the total sacrifice that we have. So one of the parallels of the concept of Jesus emptying himself in verse 7, I would go back to, say, Isaiah 53 and verse 12, where there Isaiah talking, of course, in this suffering servant passage, that he poured out himself even unto death. And so all these ideas, I think, are similar, parallel to each other. When Jesus died, he gave himself entirely and completely. And so if we can see that, and we're asking, what does it mean that he emptied himself? He gave himself up. Okay, so in the text, I think there are pointers to what that means practically. And again, like I said, this is a practical passage, not just a theological passage. And the answer to that, I think, goes back to verses 3 and 4. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. What I'm getting at with that is that when I look at what Jesus did, and I'm asking textually here, how is emptying himself really being defined? I think the answer is Jesus did nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit. But in humility, he considered others as more important than himself. He looked out for the interests of others rather than himself. And I'll tell you what's really amazing to me about that is, given the fact that he is God, which I think this passage affirms, being in very nature God, as the NIV puts it, given who he is, yet he treated others as more important than himself. He gave up himself. He didn't look at himself and say, I'm going to use my power and my abilities to do what I want to do. I think that coincides with passages like John 5 and verse 30. Jesus did nothing of his own initiative. Everything he did was in conjunction with the Father. He didn't come to do his own will, but he gave himself up. And what Paul is saying is, if we're going to follow this pattern of humility, what Paul is saying is we need to empty ourselves. Jesus is the pattern of self-emptying, and he's saying that's the pattern we need to follow. Have this mind which was in Christ Jesus. And I think kind of underlying all of that is this basic point that if Jesus, who is God, would give himself up and treat others as more important than themselves, who do we think we are if we're going to put ourselves over others? That if Jesus can do this, that's exactly what we need to be doing. And if anyone was in a position not to have to do that, it was Jesus. And we're certainly not in the position of Jesus.
I've heard before, again, that verse 7, the empty, what did he empty himself of? And, I think even the rest of verse 7 helps us too. He took the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of man. Again, it doesn't say he emptied himself of anything, as you very well pointed out. But what did he do? This is an attitude of he divested himself. He wasted all of his energies trying to serve us or trying to serve mankind. And you just said that very well. You talk about parallel concepts there. One parallel concept, see if you agree with this, is one maybe Paul in 1 Corinthians 9. He talked about the rights he could have, but he chose not to take them, really. And the reason was to facilitate the gospel. And I guess we have to, one thing I step back from here is ask why. Why would Jesus do this? He did it out of love. He did it for the facilitation of the gospel. He did it so that others might have salvation. And isn't that where maybe helps us? If we're to imitate that, what are we to imitate? We are to be sacrificial. We are to be giving ourselves up for others. We are to take I'm looking at what am I looking at here? Verse 3 and 4, the slave-like attitude. We are to take that on. And it's not easy, is it? That verse 4 is looking out for the interest of others over your own interest. That is not easy, because I think we're inclined to say, I'm going to look out for me, myself, and I. But these are the challenges. But again, the reason we're doing this study primarily is to see this is the example we have to follow. And this is something we will always fight, isn't it, Doy?
Well, the idea of self-denial and submission, which is critical to the Christian walk, if you will, is something that we tend to kind of try to shun, particularly in America. We're concerned about our rights. We have a right to this and a right to that. We have these freedoms, and we cherish those freedoms. But we can't use those freedoms in a way that oppresses others or pushes others down. And as Christians, that just wouldn't be acceptable. And this pattern right here shows when you think about it, do nothing from selfish ambition. So how much am I allowed to do from selfish ambition? Is do nothing from that. And this is the key not only to humility, but to unity. Because if you back up, Paul's talking there about making my joy complete, being in the same mind in verse 2. Same mind, same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Well, same mind. Well, what mind is that? Well, it's the mind of Christ. And the mind of Christ was such that he loved us so much that he pushed himself aside, as it were, in order to do for us what we really could not do for ourselves. And I think one of the other fascinating aspects of this is we notice in verse, if I ask the question, it says that Jesus was in the form of God, and the contrast is that he takes on the form of what? Well, a lot of times we'll say, well, he took on the form of man. Well, that's not what the text is saying here. The contrast is between the form of God and the form of the servant. And that's where he uses the terminology, taking the form of a servant. So he's in the form of God. He empties himself, takes the form of the servant, and now as he's in the likeness of men and humbles himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. I mentioned Isaiah 53 before, and I think that's kind of at the background of this, the idea of the suffering servant. Jesus took on that form, if you will, and took on the nature of the servant and died on our behalf. So again, the practical side of this is, number one, this is the way to unity, and two, this is what humility really looks like. And it may seem contrary to the way we think about God to think in terms of the humility of God, but that's exactly what this is. And if Jesus could do it, we could do it. How much more ought we to be doing it when we're not in the same position of Jesus? Because I can't say of myself, I'm in the form of God. except for, in a secondary sense, being made in God's image. And if I'm made in God's image, I need to reflect the attitude of God as well.
To me, you got chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, talking about what I call unity. And the way to do that is don't be selfish, don't be arrogant. And later on in verse 14 and 15 of the same chapter, he talks about do things without grumbling or disputing. But here's an application question, I guess. The application is obviously Jesus gave up for others. We need to follow that example. But when things get excited and if there's conflict within a local church, in any organization, people tend to form parties and sides. I've got this side, I've got that side. I think we see that today. There's people all over the board. Here's my justification for my belief. I've got a video, but then somebody else comes along, I got another video to show it and prove this. And so regarding conflicts and maybe church conflict, I would say this: most people that are in the right spend the least amount of time creating parties and people to join their side, while others are not being humble. They're just being arrogant and selfish and trying to destroy the unity that people are trying to preserve. How do we fight against that? How did Jesus fight against that? How can we, if we're just going to be humble and quiet, how can we win souls if we're being humble, meek, and quiet? Or do we have to kind of stand our ground and be known about and make statements of what the truth is?
Well, if Jesus would tell someone like Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, if it were, my servants would be fighting. And unfortunately, even though we recognize, well, of course, we're not supposed to be, fighting physical battles for Jesus in that sense. But we find ourselves biting and devouring one another sometimes, and that's what we have to be careful of. So what I have to do, and I think, again, to make this a practical application, I want to look at a passage like this and say, how am I reflecting the mind of Jesus? Now, if I'm not willing to do that, I'm probably not going to be reflecting the mind of Jesus. So on a practical level, before I say it, before I post it, before I make my argument, before I respond or whatever, how am I about to reflect the mind of Jesus? Am I doing this out of selfish ambition and conceit? In other words, make it practical. Make it a first person. Is this the way I'm acting? Am I putting the interests of others over myself? So if my attitude is, well, this is my right and I really don't care what you think, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, that's not the attitude of Jesus. Had Jesus done that, he wouldn't have died for us, because he didn't, it's not like he enjoyed the cross. And so on a practical level, what Jesus did becomes my pattern for understanding something about both humility and unity. And when it comes to unity, we might recall the prayer of Jesus in John 17, 20 and 21, as he prays for the unity of all believers. And he basically says that this is one of the ways that you're going to demonstrate that you're really my disciples. The world will look at Jesus, they'll look at us, and they'll look at Jesus, and they'll basically make a judgment as to whether or not they think it's real based upon our unity, based upon the way we treat one another. So the key to that is the mind of Christ. And am I doing this selfishly? Am I doing this out of love? Am I seeking the best interests of others? Those are the kinds of questions we have to be asking ourselves continually.
You started in verse 7, wanted to work backwards a bit. Maybe got you off your well, we're having a good discussion here. Verse 6, working backwards, he says, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Jesus did not take advantage of his deity when he could have. I think there's an important lesson for us as well. We can easily take advantage of situations, of other people. And to me, this is another key component of humility, is it not? Of not trying to win arguments, not trying to score points, not trying to make ourselves look good. We are trying to facilitate the gospel here. That's the number one goal we have here. Imitating Jesus that way. What is our end? What is our goal?
Right. So if we're looking at this passage first, theologically, we recognize that it tells us that he's equal with God. He has that equality. He has the nature. He's in the form of God. So he did not consider that something to be seized upon. Now, some will say, well, he didn't consider it something to be held onto, so he gave up his deity. But that's not the point. The point is he didn't grasp at it in order to do his own will. And I think that's consistent with other passages like John 5 and verse 30, which is interesting in context of John 5, because right there, Jesus had been working on the Sabbath, in other words, performing miracles, and he's accused of doing this on the Sabbath, and then he's also accused of making himself equal with God, because he called God the Father his own Father. And Jesus, when he responded to that, he didn't say, well, now, wait a minute, you got that all wrong. I'm really not on par with the Father. No, in fact, he doubled down on that point in verse 23 and said, you've got to honor the Son even as you honor the Father. But it's in that very same context. So he's affirmed his equality with the Father, yet in the same context recognized I can do nothing of my own initiative. As I hear, I speak. In other words, I'm doing what the Father wants me to do. So the significance there of, on the one hand, having equality, but on the other hand, also demonstrating a submissive spirit. And that submission is what, again, led him to the cross. He knew what he was doing all along. He could have called that off at some, but he was going to do this because this was the Father's will, and this was something he knew we needed. So again, I think that concept of affirming equality, and also at the same time, the humility that is found in that. He didn't consider it something to seize upon. Now, if I can, I want to make a parallel back to Genesis 3 for just a moment. And this, I'm not the first one to think about this. I mean, a lot of commentators have made this parallel. But if you think about what happened in Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve, and the serpent there telling them, God knows that in the day you eat of this, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil, and so forth. And I often make the point that if I could paraphrase that, essentially what the devil was saying was, you don't need God telling you what to do. You can decide for yourself what's right and wrong. You get to become your own God. And the problem of sin, of course, is that we are essentially dethroning God, or trying to take God off his throne. And then we usurp that throne. We put ourselves up on the throne and tell God we really don't need him. So we're taking his glory, which is why I think, Romans 3:23 says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The glory of God is very much part of this problem. So when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, what were they doing? I would suggest to you that what they were doing was grasping at godhood, grasping to be their own God, trying to take something that wasn't theirs, right? Now you come here to Philippians 2, Jesus is God. He doesn't have to try to take that. He is God. There's an equality with the Father there. And yet, even then, he didn't grasp it in order to overcome what he had to go through. That's amazing to me. This again, part of the reason I've been so intrigued with this whole passage is because it speaks volumes to the idea that here's Jesus, God in the flesh, and yet look at what he did for us. It's just an amazing thing. And if he could do that, again, who do we think we are when we try to put ourselves over others?
An amazing parallel there. Mentioned Stockton in the garden. I think we see it today. I'll give this analogy. I just got through watching the Michael Jordan special, The Last Dance, on ESPN. Enjoyed that, reliving some basketball days from the 90s and those great stories. And I think it was at the end of episode 6 where the camera showed how, I would just say, how idolized Michael Jordan was. Couldn't go anywhere, had to stay in his room because people were just fawning over him and so forth. And at the end of that particular episode, Jordan himself talked about how hard that is. I can't live up to people's expectations of, basically, I'm a paraphrase, people making me like a godlike figure. And isn't it tragic how we just see this over and over and over and over and over again throughout history in our own times, where we're looking for anywhere but to God of the Bible, Yahweh. We're looking for idols, or idols around us, and we want to make those gods and make that a deity of some sort to fulfill our needs. When, if you read Ecclesiastes, these things are what leave us empty and our vanity, and they just don't fill us up. But we keep looking for those things, and people that are like Jordan type, who's a fantastic basketball player, saying, I'm just a basketball player. Please don't make me this role model. Please don't. I didn't ask for this idol worship that you're giving me, because I cannot live up to your needs, and how disappointed people will be. But we see that all the time. That came to mind when you said grasping at godhood, and people trying to snatch what's theirs, either trying to make themselves a god or look for gods and things that aren't going to be gods to them, and how tragic that is. And I guess that takes humility, doesn't it?
Well, and if you think about it, that's really kind of what Romans 1 talks about. The idea of someone who, fails to give God thanks, they become futile in their thinking. Essentially what they're doing is exchanging the glory of God for the glory of corruptible man, four-footed beasts and animals. Basically, we take what is not God and we make it God. And that includes ourselves. We make ourselves into our own gods. This is the nature of idolatry. And, again, that's what Adam and Eve did. That's what we do when we sin. So when we come to Jesus, and here he is, who is God, basically submitting himself and refusing to take, advantage of his godhood. And if you think about it, the first temptation, Matthew 4, Luke 4, recorded, if you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. I don't think the devil was saying, we're not really sure if you're the Son of God. So if maybe you, no, I think what he's saying is, since you're the Son of God, we all know you are. When Jesus confronted demons, they knew exactly who he was. You're the Holy One of God. Since you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. In other words, take advantage of that godhood. Seize upon the fact that you're the Son of God and do something with that. And Jesus refused to do it. Which again is what makes this passage of Philippians 2 so amazing. Here he is in the form of God, equal with God, doesn't consider that something to grab onto and use, but rather to empty himself, completely deny himself, and give himself over as the suffering servant to the cross. And then says to us, this is your example. This is what you need to be doing.
It starts with humility. Humble people don't make the headlines generally. We don't see TV shows. Let's brag about how humble a person is, and it goes against the idea of being humble. They don't want the spotlight. They just want to be right with God. Here's a comment from our chat session. I'm going to read this. I think you can see it as well, from Leila. She says, quote, I think that many divisions are caused by people being unwilling to entertain the idea that they may be wrong, which is a kind of arrogance. If we cannot humble ourselves enough to admit that we don't know everything, or that we are fallible, then we will not be able to find the unity with others, and certainly not with God. I think that's a great comment. I think anytime there is some sort of disagreement, you have to enter that situation with the assumption that you could be wrong, and I think approach it. Or what I see Doy doing, I only know 10% of the story. I think I know everything, but I only know 10% of the story. So let's talk about this, and being humble enough to accept those ideas. And that may minimize or eradicate a lot of division that's out there, unfortunately, because there is obviously way too much division out there. And a lot of it's personality driven, I think.
Well, we've any of us who've spent much time preaching, and we've a lot of us have been with multiple congregations, and we've seen the backbiting and division firsthand, and it's not just on Facebook, but you see that sometimes, and it's heartbreaking, because we all know that we ought to know better. And I always think once again about this point in Philippians 2, do nothing from selfishness. Let me back up even into chapter 1. In verse 27, he says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I will hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Notice again this repetition of mind. You're having one mind in 127, and then again in chapter 2 and verse 2, being of the same mind, and then have the attitude of Christ, have the mind of Christ. Obviously, an important point contextually, and it's all wrapped up in both humility and unity. So if we refuse to be reconciled with one another, are we showing the attitude of Jesus? And the answer seems to be pretty clear. No, you're not.
The issues at Philippi were serious. As I read verse 1 and verse 27 with you, and you have to ask, okay, why is he saying conduct yourself in a worthy manner of the gospel? Later on in the book, there's problems. Chapter 3 and verse 2, he calls people dogs. They're the false circumcision. There's a false idea. In chapter 4 and verse 2, you have two sisters that are named. How would you like that in a congregation? Two sisters have an argument, and it's forever memorialized in your scriptures 2,000 years later. I mean, that'd be awful. But those are the things that the church at Philippi was up against. And that's what we're talking about here. And that's the importance of this lesson to me, is here's the remedy. Here's the antidote for these potential problems that could divide you. You need to take on humility here. And so, again, that's why this is so important. And it's not that Jesus gave up his deity. He just came in and didn't take advantage of his deity, but paved the way, gave us an example on how to be humble. Let's not forget what's the opposite of being humble, is being cocky, being arrogant, being full of yourself. And obviously that is what drives division. That is what causes many of the problems that we see. And as you say, verse 4, it's just, I got my own interest, thank you very much. And that's all I care about. Well, that's disastrous. And that's what leads to all these problems. But it is all about humility, isn't it?
Yeah, and we understand that, I mean, if someone is going to be taking on the contrary doctrine and being divisive that way and so forth, we obviously have to make judgments about the way that happens, and not, in other words, he's not saying it's unity at the cost of truth, but at the same time, we can speak truth in ways that are not very humble as well. And that's why Ephesians 4 tells us to speak the truth in love. And so I think, again, the first place to start with any of this is, where am I here? What is my attitude about this? How am I reflecting the mind of Christ? That has to be kind of the first question we're asking. And then we can move forward from there. Now, if everybody were doing this, if everybody did this, imagine the unity then that we could have, because I'm not now trying to push things according to my will. I'm not just trying to get things done like I want it done. I'm not a Diotrephes, just trying to do my own thing and take charge and be over everybody else. If everybody were doing this, we would see some very different results.
Is it safe to say there's maybe room for differences of opinion? Not differences in the gospel, but differences in opinion. You and I talked offline before. I'll give this example. In our current times, I mean, I live in greater Portland, Oregon area, and our current times, if you wear a mask, some people look at you like you're just a face, that you're supporting those who are trying to be tyrants and so forth. But if you don't wear a mask, you're shouted down as a murderer. So there's all these extreme views that I just try to stay out of. You and I talked about this beforehand, but I honestly think there's room for disagreement. But it's what I'm concerned about is what people do with those disagreements. And you can have disagreements on some of those things that are, again, COVID-19 is not in the Bible. You can't look at book, chapter, verse. But what we do learn from passages like this is our attitude about such things. And yeah, people are going to have differences of opinion. It doesn't bother me. But what bothers me is what people do with those differences of opinion. And maybe that's what this speaks to, is our attitude and how we respond to such things or don't respond to such things. Is there room for disagreement here and then still be loving brethren for each other? I sure hope so. I mean, people have strong opinions over these things, and not just that example I gave, but a lot of things. And so we have to be careful, right?
Well, you take a passage like Romans 14, and you see the difference in the attitudes that are expressed there. and specifically something like eating meats. God is very clear about all foods being clean now. And so there's nothing, edible theoretically that, is off the table that was sinful or whatever. But uh, if somebody said, well, conscientiously, I can't eat that or whatever, they have a right to do that. And we don't have a right to look down on that or say, well, you're somehow really weak or whatever. I need to respect that. And so if I'm having that person, if we're having that person over to dinner, the last thing we want to do is put that thing before them that we know they have a problem with. We're going to stay as far away from that as we can because we care about the person. I might think they're wrong in the way they might view something, but it's not my task at that point to just work them over and try to, get them to change right then and there and, this and that. I got to respect their conscience. It's okay to differ in those things. And Romans 14 makes that clear.
We had a bunch of Muslims come into our house at one point, trying to study and so forth. And Jen would cook them dinner, but they wanted to see the package on the ingredients to make sure there was no pork in those meals. And we were very happy to accommodate them. It was very interesting. That's about the only thing they were concerned about at that point. Sadly, they wanted to make sure that they put no pork in their bodies, but after they left our house, they were going to the adult nightclubs and so forth. That didn't bother them, but at least we got that right. We were, this is sort of a note aside, we made sure we fit their dietary restrictions, but back in this case, we can have the disagreements, but we don't have to be that disagreeable person. We want to make sure that we are accommodative, but that's that slave-like mentality, right? That's that servant, that's putting others first. That's not looking out for our own interest. To me, that's where the application here comes in of Philippians 3.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to avoid doing is saying something like, look how humble I am because I'm treating somebody else this way. I think they're wrong, but I'm going to go ahead and do it their way just to make them happy or whatever. Now that becomes a form of bragging. Which is not pride. And, the interesting, or not humility, but the interesting thing, of course, with humility is often pointed out, is the moment you think you have it, you've lost it. Mm-hmm. And you see a lot of this, again, the mentality, and I have to look at myself and say, well, is that what I'm expressing? If I think I'm humble, I'm probably not. If I think I'm woke, I'm probably asleep. If I think I got it all figured out, it's like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8, if you think you know something, you really don't know. You got to be careful with that pride. And that is the thing that rears its ugly head over and over in us, in me. And that's why I've said so many times, Luke 9:23, in my view, for me, is the hardest commandment given. If anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, because self keeps rearing its ugly head. In my case, that's pretty literal. So, that keeps getting in the way. My pride, myself, and that directly relates to Philippians 2. Empty self. That's the point he's making. Jesus emptied himself. So why would he bring that up? Because he's our example. Have the mind of Christ. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. Empty yourself and follow his example. That's the point. It's not easy. That's, denying self is the hardest thing to do, but that's what he's calling us to do.
Personally, I struggle with this aspect of that. I mean, I try to be humble. That's the goal. Selfishness always creeps in, but I just know in my life, if somebody comes to me and comes across as a know-it-all, sit down for an hour, let me lecture you and tell you what you need to do with your diet or with your life or anything, that's a big turnoff for me, and I'm going to shut this person down. And that's maybe something I should work on more. But I just try not to emulate that when I have a chance to talk with others. But the struggle that I have sometimes is, I want to make sure I'm available, open, reasonable, approachable, all those things when it comes to talking the gospel with people. And I do have a lot of success and opportunities to do that. But I need to not come across as, again, a know-it-all here. Just sit down and shut up, and I'll tell you all you need to know in a 30-minute lesson. And what's the problem? Why can't you respond? I don't do that, obviously, but you have to engage, ask questions, listen, see where they're at. And again, that takes humility also. Again, we're talking about the facilitation of the gospel. I've transitioned there. But we need to make sure we don't come across as the arrogant people that I think the world think Christians are. You Christians are nothing but self-righteous. And you could think you have all the answers. Well, I guess we do have the answers. Here's the Bible, but you can engage in a way, ask questions. It's been around a couple thousand years, a lot of it longer. Why do you think that is versus just lecturing somebody? So there's ways to approach that. But if you can't speak to that balance, is that a struggle for you, Doy? Do you think that's a common struggle?
Well, I'd say it's a common struggle. I think when we think we've got the answer, we want to jump in there with it and make sure that everybody knows we have that answer. And that's just a hard thing. And I'll tell you, it's especially a difficult thing for people who teach, for preachers and others who are often, kind of put up there on the podium, and they're being listened to. We especially have to go back to a passage like Philippians 2 and be reminded of the fact that Jesus is God, and yet he emptied himself. I'm nowhere near that. Who would I think that I am that I should put myself over others?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a constant reminder, I think, of the struggle we have to deny ourselves, take up the cross, follow him, and put ourselves under others in submission. And that's a difficult thing, especially if we're conditioned to think in terms of rights and entitlements, and I'm not going to let anybody walk on me. Have the mind of Christ. That's what it means to be a child of God.
Very good. Anything else, Doy, or is this going to wrap it up for us?
No, I would just say that, I would encourage people to really read this passage regularly. Think about the implications of it. Look at who Jesus is. Look at what he did. And then ask ourselves, how are we going to follow that example to have the mind of Christ by not being selfishly ambitious and not putting ourselves over others? We seek the interests of others first. That's what Jesus did. He emptied himself. I need to empty myself.
Very good. Thank you, Doy. Before I put it end on Facebook Live, let me say, I don't know how many times I've stayed at your house and kept you up late by asking questions like I just did the last 45 minutes and getting great answers like I've gotten. So thank you for all those times together and the friendship, and for letting me in the family, making me feel welcome. I think I know more about the family than my wife does, who is part of the family, just because I've spent so much time with you and your family. So thank you for all those times. I'm going to end the Facebook Live feed. So Doy, have a fun way of saying goodbye to Facebook.
Well, appreciate the opportunity, and glad to see you once again. We've missed the last little while of you staying at our house at various times, but next time you come, bring the halo. We'll take you on.
Very good. Thank you. Let me stay online, Doy. Let me end the Facebook Live.